Kindred Resistors Against the Dysgenesis of Modernity. This is Govan here with GovanKilgour.com. Going on with the zodiac sign, or signs, and the alphabet around them, and looking at the insight we can get from them, we can see and start to look at some organizations or religions or secret societies that have placements in different parts of these charts. And if we think of oppositions, meaning one letter being opposite from the other, we can start to see some patterns emerge when we compare these. So the easiest ones to do, which we're starting off with, is the two letters that are actually right on cusps. And the only ones when you do the chart in this way happen to be the T and the G. And that's the vertical axis we see between Gemini and Cancer at the top, and then Sagittarius and Capricorn at the bottom. Now, if you're thinking of the zodiac as a full year, we have the summer solstice at the top, the winter solstice at the bottom. And what is most obvious when you look at this is the letter T, especially if it's a small t, not the capital T, makes a cross. And if you've ever watched those old, what are they? I'll find the name of it after the fact and just throw it on the screen here, but that old documentary that made the rounds on YouTube, there's several of them, but the first one really went viral years ago and kind of kicked off kind of a mainstream, or a increasingly mainstream acceptance of a lot of theories on some things, looking into religion, but also specifically the banking system and money printing and all that. In that, they talked a lot about the cross at the winter solstice being like Christ dying on the cross, God's son, and that applies here. Obviously, we think of Easter as being Jesus dying on the cross and the resurrection, but and then on winter solstice is his birth. Now, obviously, I would agree that that's a bit of a stretch to move that sort of death on the cross to there. Just in the Christian context, we do have the solar cross and the rebirth of the sun at that time. And Christmas being on the 25th, that's when you actually notice the increase in the days beginning. So there's a few days right around that winter solstice when there isn't actually a huge change. It's almost like, if you think of the full moon, when you get to the new moon and the full moon, if you look at either end of the extremes, there's a few days either side where you don't actually see much difference. And if you have a lunar app on your phone, I'm always tracking that, it gets down and slows down in terms of the percentage falling per day. So the percentages of how full the moon is change more rapidly towards the middle of the changes, but when you're close to the full moon or the new moon, it's actually a day before, or even 2 days before, it's at 1%. And that last 1% going down to absolutely 0% for the new moon, it's actually quite slow compared to like when the moon is at half full, or whether it's waxing or waning. There's a couple percentage points that change every day. So there's a lot of percentage change per day when it's at that halfway point, and then as it gets closer to the fuller new moon, it's much slower and imperceptible. And this is the same thing with the sun. It's just on a yearly time frame in terms of the length of the days. There's not a lot of difference between the 20th and the 22nd, if we're talking about the winter solstice being on the 21st. Those 2 days, or even going another day out either side, there's really barely any perceptible difference in the length of the day there. And so a lot of people say, well, how's Christmas synonymous with the winter solstice when it's 4 days later? Well, that's when you can start to see a change. Or if you think of our ancient ancestors, if they were tracking this, the Christmas day would be when maybe, if they had some archaic way of measuring the length of the day with like stones lined up in some way, that might be the day when they're for certain the sun is going to return. And so the sun is born, and that T being down there is opposed to the G at the summer solstice. Now, if we think of Christianity as being representative of the T at the winter solstice, what has been, it's varied over the centuries, obviously, but what's been a major opponent to the church, or more specifically the Vatican, the Catholic Church, in the world? And no, I'm not talking about Protestantism. I'm talking about ideologically in a deeper way. And I would say it's pretty clearly Freemasonry. There's a lot of instances throughout history of major fighting that's gone back and forth between them. And if you look at the countries that have been historically most aligned with Freemasonry, and they've changed over the centuries of what we know to be Freemasonry. Now, yeah, a lot of these different groups over time have had different allegiances, and, but a major one was, of course, the UK, and the British Crown, more specifically than the people of the UK, even though you have the Scottish Rite and these other aspects of Freemasonry, which were definitely developed in the United Kingdom, and Scotland and England. But I'd also say that the Freemasonry we think of today, which may have become more nefarious over time, I would argue that it was a little more neutral. And it's also to say, before I get deeper into this, I'd also say that these associations doesn't mean that the signs that they fall under have negative connotations. So in the next video, I'll talk a lot about the opposition between Taurus and Scorpio. Now, that doesn't mean one or the other is evil per se, even though we could say that some of the things going on in one of the signs may be very evil. It's just to say that the symbology of that sign and the letter there happens to correspond to things going on in the world that are very evil, and the opposition to it might be very benevolent and good intentioned, but that's just the manifestation of those things in the world today. It's the archetype behind those things are just being corrupted in their expression in the world by these groups or organizations. And so if we're talking right now about the letter G and the area around it, the letters around it, representing Freemasonry, it might have changed over time. I'm not associated with Freemasonry in any way. I should actually preface and say that. But I've always been fascinated with it. When I was up in Scotland in 2016, I was there twice. Scotland, that is, not the specific location. I only went to the Orkneys in the summer of 2016. But I went right up to the Orkneys, the main island. There's a place called Kirkwall, a very famous port. And there is one of the most ancient or priceless Freemason artifacts there, which you can see for free if you just request some people at the temple. They'll take you in there. You don't need to be a Freemason to go in there. And I saw the Kirkwall Scroll, which is this tapestry. It's too long to have completely unfurled, but it is very fascinating to see in person. You can see images of it online. Exactly what it means, I don't know, but I got to see that in person, which was quite special. So the letter G, obviously we have that associated with the symbol of Freemasonry. What they say it represents varies. It could mean God, it could mean geometry, and some people might say it refers to Saint Germain, who was a Freemason and alchemist, and his legend in the past is quite intriguing. Exactly what, how realistic some of these things are, we don't know, but we can speculate that he was a sort of ascended master type character who could do these things. And some people will try to, who view Freemasonry in an entirely negative light, they try and then say that, well, Saint Germain was a negative entity or like a demonic entity. And I think that's quite a stretch, considering these same people will say like the way Freemasonry took out monarchies, specifically the French monarchy, was evil, or was like a takeover. But then at the same time you had Saint Germain warning the King and Queen of France, Marie Antoinette and Louis XIV. He was warning them about the revolt that was coming. And that actually happened very shortly after Freemasonry was infiltrated by the Illuminati, which we know happened from the incursion of Adam Weishaupt, I think the first Rothschild, Meyer Amschel Rothschild, and then Jacob Frank, the possible reincarnation of Sabbatai Zevi, and they formed the Illuminati, which was sort of like a Sabbatean cult, which, if it's true that they infiltrated Freemasonry, both to begin with in Germany, but then it spread to other parts of the world, specifically the UK, that would mean that at that point on, that's when Freemasonry became very corrupted. I'm not a scholar on these things, so I can't say for sure what my thoughts are on, some of these ideas before then, but again, we're looking at things in modern times and what Freemasonry represents now. You have that letter G at the pinnacle there being clearly a Masonic symbol. Then if you go to either side of it, you have the signs of both Gemini and Cancer. You have the letter E, which could represent Egyptian symbolism, which is heavy in Freemasonry. You also have the I, as in written out, the Eye of Horus. The H in Cancer could represent Horus, Hiram Abiff. And then you have the letter I, which could represent Illuminati. And also, just like the letter E representing the I, which you see the all-seeing eye in Freemasonic symbolism, you also have just simply the letter I representing the eye. That could also be the Eye of Horus, or the Eye of Ra. But I went with Horus just because the letter H is there, or the Eye of God. It doesn't have to be Egyptian, but we do see that eye first appearing in Egyptian iconography. And then when it's the eye in the pyramid, that's when you have the more modern symbolism there. Then if you look at the signs of Gemini and Cancer on their own, and you look at their actual symbols, you have Gemini, which is two pillars, or two lines. That is another prominent Masonic symbol of Jachin and Boaz. These are also probably related to the symbols of the pillars in Kabbalah. You have the pillar of severity and the pillar of mercy there. Then for Cancer, which is a little more of a stretch, you have the sort of 69 on its side symbol. A lot of people laugh at this one, but if you rearrange this a little bit, it starts to look like it could be the sign for Tubal-Cain. Tubal-Cain is kind of like a wordplay in that it can also mean two-ball cane, literally two balls in a cane, which is a phallic symbol. This is sometimes represented by the percentage sign, but if you rearrange it further, you can get the 007, and the letter G is the 7th letter of the alphabet. That makes an association there with the letter 7 being quite prominent in Masonry. But specifically, if you go back in time to John Dee, that's the origin of the 007. I believe he was a spy for Queen Elizabeth. He signed his letters back to her as 007. That was his name, pen name for that work he was doing. He was also an astrologer, an astronomer, a scientist, an alchemist, and a magician. And then if you look at the signs themselves, Gemini being ruled by Mercury, Cancer being ruled by the moon, you can definitely call Freemasonry as a lunar and mercurial religion or belief system or group, society. They are very much about the qualities of those two things. They follow a lunar calendar, I believe. Kind of like how Judaism is a Saturnian and lunar religion, for the most part. There's definitely offshoots that might differ a bit, but the symbolism within the religion has a lot to do with Saturn and the moon. And likewise with Freemasonry, you see a lot of mercurial and lunar symbolism. It is said that Saint Germain was a reincarnation of Hermes, Trismegistus, and again, that would be sort of like their Christ figure. I'm sure many Masons would disagree with me. That's just sort of an outside interpretation of it. Then if you look at the letters themselves, we see some peculiar in that in Masonry there's an emphasis on geometry and angles because they were originally actual Masons, builders, and they used measuring tools, and they used those tools in their society for what can be thought of as sort of like a spiritual progress and self-improvement type of work that they did, the great work. And you have the letters E and H, which are the two letters with 4 right angles in them. The only letters in the alphabet with 4 right angles. Then you also have the letter F, which has 3 right angles in it. Um, and after that, there's a number of other letters with 2 right angles, but you have the only 2 letters with 4 right angles, and then the only letter with 3 right angles all fall within these 5 letters, the E, H, and the F. That's an interesting little thing that I thought made sense being placed there as well. Something I'm not too familiar with, but I had heard about and kind of looked into a little bit over the last few months here and there, just watched the odd video about it, is this interesting theory around Tartary. Now, I don't know too much about it and to what degree it's authentic, but it seems like an interesting theory that this ancient civilization, even not that ancient, it was really only a few hundred years ago that it was prominent, but it's been wiped from our understanding of history, and that it may have been much bigger and much more prolific of a civilization than simply just a term for a loose sort of contingent of peoples inhabiting sort of Siberia and across into Russia. But the Tartars are recognized as a people, and having had their own culture and various other aspects going on. But the fact that they may have probably had their own clear architectural traits in the buildings they created, and that we can see some of those traits in places quite wide spanning across both Asia and into Europe, and possibly even in North America. It's a stretch, but there may be something to this, I don't know. But the fact that that is there, and that might be wiped out to such a great degree, that might make sense as also having been oppositional to Freemasonry, in that perhaps this movement, which was much more unified behind Freemasonry a few hundred years ago, may have wiped the slate clean of these the influence of Tartary in our history books. And the reason people think this was a real thing is because there's still remnants of like old maps that shows this big landmass that was all called Tartary, and they had very clear cities and places that were clearly named and mapped out. And then you see other influences there. But it was clear that for whatever reason, the Western powers, which maybe have been Freemasonic dominant, may have opposed them. And so that word T down at the bottom, not only could it be considered like the way Christianity has been opposed by Freemasonry, it could be that Tartary was also an oppositional force to Freemasonry, which we could say is also now behind globalism, which might be the letter G. So that is sort of a description that is, for me, continually unfolding. I'm learning more about it as I think about it and just look at this diagram more. You might find some of your own connections there, and if this is descriptive of something going on in the world on a larger scale, there is insights here that we can glean from that. It's definitely big picture stuff here. We're not talking about like being able to determine more micro things that are going on, but I find it interesting to look at. Another thing I found interesting, which actually doesn't have an oppositional thing going on, but if we think back to the Roman Empire, and the 2 planets that come to mind when I think of the Roman Empire is Jupiter and Mars. It was definitely martial because it has had strong military emphasis, and it rose to prominence at the tail end of the age of Aries, and then as it moved into Pisces, the Jupiter became much more prominent in that it was an expansive civilization. And an abbreviation for the term for the ancient Roman Empire was the Senatus Populusque Romanus, otherwise known as the SPQR. And if we look at those letters on the diagram here, they're not in the right order, but you just rearrange them, you've got the P, Q, R, and S. So, yeah, you just rearrange those, and those 2 signs are Sagittarius, ruled by Jupiter, and Scorpio, whose ancient ruler was Mars. Traditional rulers, Pluto, you could say there's a Pluto influence in the Roman Empire. I think it's much more martial, and the fact that they hadn't discovered Pluto at the time might indicate that. But you got things like that, which you can find time and time again when you look at groups and their letters and where they fall on the zodiac wheel here. seems to embody the traits expressed in the archetypes of the zodiac wheel there. Now, Rome had various different opponents at different times. You could maybe say the sea represented Carthage, because early on in Rome's rise, they had the opposition of Carthage, the Carthaginians, and I believe their ruling god was Moloch, who was a horned cow or Taurus, a bull, and you've got the sign of Taurus with the sea there for Carthage. That might be the connection there. Although I would want to look at this in more depth and try and find a different sort of broader oppositional civilization there. As the SPQR is much broader and envelops multiple signs there, I'd want to find something sort of equivalent in breadth on the other side of the zodiac there. But yeah, these are just little things I was finding as I was examining this over the few months and weeks that I've been looking at this, which I found interesting. Another prominent opposition, and kind of the last one I'll talk about for the time being, is a little more to the side. We've got Aquarius is opposite Leo. And specifically, if you take the W, its opposite is J. Now, what could the W represent? There's a lot of different things. Obviously, the sign of Aquarius is traditional ruler Saturn, but modern ruler is Uranus. If we take the J, it's ruled by the Sun. Now, this might be another stretch. We could say the perception here is more of their own self-perception. The Sun could be a bit altered in that it's not an expression of the Sun, but rather it's an expression of the ego, because we often associate the Sun with the ego in our chart. And this J might be Judah, the Lion of Judah, and then the W could be the sort of expression of Uranus in the Third Reich. So the W being the 23rd letter of the alphabet, you've got the 2 prongs on the bottom and the 3 on the top. This is something that B.R. Taylor definitely pointed out, which I'm kind of repeating here, is that if you take the year 0 and you take Uranus's near perfect 84 year, it's like 84 years in like a fraction of a day or a day and a half or something of our Earth years that it takes for Uranus to do one cycle around the Sun. So if you go from year 0 and you add 84 and you keep on going, adding 84 plus 84 plus 84, when you've hit 23 times, so just take 84, multiply it by 23, you get 1933. Now, if you also look at the uncle's birth chart, you're going to see something interesting with Uranus, the planet of rebellion. It is nearly conjunct his rising sign. Now, B.R. Taylor used his birth time as 6:30, I believe, p.m. And there's been what's called Astrological Rectification, which is when you change someone's birth time based on events, because we're not certain that that's his exact time. It might have been actually put out as a different time to throw off people that were trying to use his chart for a magical attack. It looks like he was probably born at 6:03 p.m. If you do that, you get a much closer conjunct between Uranus and his rising sign. So some people say Uranus was in his 12th house. I would put it as Uranus was in his first house, or pretty much conjunct his rising sign, and that makes it more prominent as to the prominence of the Uranian manifestation that we saw in the NSDAP. So the symbology of Uranus was all over the place in this sort of Aquarian type movement, which was the Third Reich. So I find it interesting right now that we're looking at all these different symbols and how they could be opposed to each other. And again, we're not ascribing good or bad to each of these. We're just looking at the connections we can make here. Another thing is the VW symbol, Volkswagen. The V is right there in Capricorn. The W is right there. Those were prominent in that whole political movement as well. If you're enjoying the content that I'm putting out, check out a link below to watch some videos and read about a privacy browser that's free to download, which, if you happen to enjoy it and use it for a short period of time, they actually send me a bit of money, which will help me in continuing to create this content. It is a unique browser that, besides all its privacy features, also allows you to make a bit of money through a cryptocurrency when you enable the ad feature on the browser. And it actually blocks out other types of ads, but it has its own network of advertisers within the browser, which pops up very sort of not that distracting ads. They're not really in your face or anything, but they're just in the top corner and where they appear. You can see what they look like on the screen right now, and you just close them. And depending on the price of the cryptocurrency itself, you get a small fraction of a BAT for every ad you see, and BAT stands for Brave Attention Token. The browser, of course, is called the Brave browser, and when the price is high, you get smaller denominations of the BAT token for each ad that appears. But if the price is very low, like it is right now, you actually get a bigger chunk, and so every dozen or 2 dozen ads or so, you're going to get an entire unit of BAT, one token. And as you accumulate these tokens, you can either hold on to them for when the price of BAT goes up, probably with next time Bitcoin goes up in price, or you can use it to tip content creators online, whether it's just through their own website or even over Twitter. I believe has a feature where you can enable BAT tipping. I also just, in this little segment here outside of the regular video, wanted to point out one other thing I saw in editing, where if we consider the X to the K from Aquarius to Leo, there's some other things I sort of noticed here. The K could obviously stand for kosher or Kabbalah, and specifically the type of Kabbalah that begins with a K, which is the Jewish Kabbalah. The Q Kabbalah is more of the esoteric Western Kabbalah, which has some aspects of the Egyptian tradition within it. But if we're talking just about the Judaic Kabbalah, that could be the K letter there. And with the X, the one association I see here is obviously, if we're kind of sticking to the theme that we're associating with these two signs, you could have St. Andrew's Cross, which of course is on the Scottish flag, numerous other flags, but especially the Confederate battle flag. And there was an interesting thing that's in the midst of happening, which was in 2017, there was the first complete solar eclipse that completely transited the United States in a very long time. I forget the exact date of the past one, but it was quite a while ago. I believe harkening back to, I'll throw the date up on the screen actually for the last one. I think it coincided with something major in the US, but uniquely to this one that just happened in 2017, we have another one coming in 2024. And it is intersecting the U.S. in the other direction, from the southern border to the northern border. I'm not sure which direction it's actually going in there, south to north or north to south, but what we see there is the intersection, which creates a big X across the U.S. It obviously passes through Canada and Mexico, this upcoming one as well. And that's significant in just the effect eclipses have on regions where they're most intensely visible. So obviously all over North America, that last one in 2017, a lot of us could see. It wasn't totally complete where I was, but I'll have the opportunity to go see the complete eclipse just by going like half an hour south from where I am. And I think this is quite auspicious and a good sign of things to come, because solar eclipses really have sort of that tear down type energy of destroying old things that are no longer serving the planet, but especially the areas geopolitically or geographically where they occur. And I think since 2017 we've seen an acceleration of that. There's obviously been a lot of things people have been irritated with that have been lagging, but I think we're starting to see some of that movement in those things happening. So astrologically, eclipses are very interesting to watch for that purpose. Also, with the letter X there, if you watched my video on the Aquarian age and you understand the precession of the equinox and how slow and long that whole cycle is, we've just entered the age of Aquarius, that 2,150 year cycle, And because we're going in reverse zodiacal order through the precession of the equinox, the letter X is roughly where we would be at, or we would be hitting that general area if you think of that whole zodiacal wheel as a 25,000 year cycle. And we're slowly going counterclockwise through it as it's shown on the screen here. The letter X is roughly where we're at. So whether it's been something prominent already, I think it's actually going to be a more prominent letter coming up over the next 1,000 years before we actually reach the letter W. So whether there's going to be groups emerging or movements that have some sort of embodiment of the letter X, I don't know. I'm just making a vague guess at what might be, or whether someone's listening to this and decides to start something, you could incorporate the letter X into whether it's the symbolism of a flag or just an emblem of some kind. The letter X could be a powerful one as being the representative sign of the times. And specifically that St. Andrew's cross is also called the Saltire cross. Also take note that the X can appear as an equal armed cross, not just as the upright X, but sort of like a plus sign type of X. So whether this has any significance going forward or not, who knows? I'm just putting it out there. And so, yeah, you start to see that there's, especially if we're going to talk about the next video, there's going to be some things you see where there's sort of multiple sections of the bottom part of the zodiac here that are opposed to multiple sections of this top part. And you'll understand this more after the next video. But it's almost like we see the underdogs here always fighting these world powers. And it's been a slog through the centuries, but I think we're starting to see cracks in their foundation. I think things are starting to come undone. Whether we see it all resolve within our lifetime, I somehow doubt that. But I think we're going to see progress for the betterment of humankind within our lifetime. And also if you divide the zodiac from Aries to Virgo as being sort of the conscious part of the mind, the subconscious being the signs in the dark. These signs are working to overthrow the aspects of the consciousness in humanity, the conscious elements of humanity, the controlling aspects of humanity that have been deeply corrupted for a long time. And even though any one of these movements might not look like they've been successful, whether we're talking about the ones in the past or the ones that are emerging, they're making headway, I think. And I find astrology good for just giving a sense of feeling of positivity around this. It feels good to actually have some hope, even if it's on a big picture macro scale in this way. And that's going to tie into some of the later videos I'll be doing after these on these macro cycles. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, favorite, and share the video if you feel so inclined. And I'll talk to you again soon. Take care.